A warm welcome to all of you here who have come this afternoon to the Institute for Human Sciences, to our library. My name is Ivan Vejvoda. I'm the acting rector of the Institute, and it gives me a great pleasure and honor to launch this two-day event, a conference on how Europe thinks about itself in a changing world. This is part and parcel of our 40th anniversary of the Institute for Human Sciences. We will have several events during the course of the year. And this particular event we are doing in collaboration with Oxford University, the Dahrendorf Forum, St. Anthony's College, their project, the Europe in a Changing World. When we were organizing this conference, and actually we began talking about it more than a year ago, and thanks to Professor Timothy Garton-Ash, who is here with us, we came to this idea of discussing these fundamental issues about Europe, how it sees itself, how others see it. And of course, in the meantime, we are witnessing a horrendous aggression by Russia on a sovereign European country called Ukraine. And we are in the 41st day, I believe, of that invasion with all the tragic events that are occurring. For that reason, we decided to begin this conference with this panel, Ukraine and the Future of Europe. And it is no surprise that we chose our two speakers. I will introduce Kate Younger, who is, as of recently, a permanent fellow, and we're very happy that Kate has joined the permanent fellows team. She, until becoming a permanent fellow, but she continues to do that, has led the Ukraine in European dialogue. We are one of the rare institutes that has a dedicated Ukraine program that actually happened after the first invasion by Russia of Ukraine in 2014, and we're doing a number of things which we will maybe mention. Kate is a historian. She has written on the region. Also, I must say, edited a volume on Balkans history, which I'm particularly happy about. So we're very happy to have Kate with us, and she will be the first to speak today. And of course, next to Kate is Timothy Garton-Ash. I won't use the usual cliche. I will introduce Tim, who is a professor of European Studies at St. Anthony's College of Oxford University. He is also a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, the author of numerous books, a witness to all the things that have happened both prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the wall itself, and has written numerous books. On a very personal note, I met Tim when he came to Belgrade back in 2001 for the translation of his book, The File. We in Serbia were beginning to do Vergangenheitsbewältigung, confronting our past, and we thought it was very important to have Tim explain to us not only his personal history, but what was happening. And in fact, at that conference, we had someone called Thomas Gauck, who later became the president, the federal president of Germany. So this will last an hour. You have the program of the conference. We will have two public events. This is the first one. Later on at 6 p.m., we will have the presentation of Julia de Klerk-Sax's work, and then in between a panel and tomorrow's two panels. So without further ado, Kate.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for this introduction and for inviting me to take part in this conversation. Timothy, it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you today. I'm here as a bit of an outsider today, right? Neither a Ukrainian, though I do have the honor of coordinating our Ukraine programs at the IWM, nor a European, as my Midwest accent betrays. But I'm very glad to be part of an important conversation at a critical time. These past few days have been some of the grimmest days of a grim war. Since the war began with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, I've thought often of a conversation that took place in this very library last fall, as fears of a looming Russian invasion built up. The philosopher Volodymyr Yarmolenko, one of Ukraine's leading young public intellectuals who these days is writing, appearing for media, doing a podcast, volunteering everything he can to support the Ukrainian war effort, was here presenting his new book project in intellectual history that explores the interconnectedness and interplay between Ukrainian and broader European thought over the past 3 centuries. He emphasized the emergence and triumph of the Republican idea of politics over its imperial counterpart, and he concluded his paper with the idea that, and I looked this up, the success of the Ukrainian political project can lead to the transfer of the Republican idea of Europe further to the east. Its failure, instead, can lead to the reestablishment of the neo-imperial ideas of politics in Europe and beyond. In the discussion that we had here after he presented his project, the point was made several times, I think, that the vision of Europe that he presented was an awfully rosy one, perhaps unfairly rosy. It minimized the ideologically driven violence, mass violence of the 20th century, and presented a narrative of progress that Europe frequently failed to live up to. And for a lot of reasons, that conversation between a Ukrainian who saw the good sides of the European idea and European colleagues who saw its glaring faults has kept coming to mind. In recent days, Volodymyr Zelensky has rightly emphasized that Ukrainians are not naive. He made this comment in reference to peace talks and the apparent Russian pullback around Kiev, saying that we are not naive enough to take Russians at their words here. But I think the charge of naivete is often leveled against Ukrainians when it comes to their views of Europe, what Europe can and will do for them. But what if instead of naivete, we understood it as a conscious decision on the part of Ukrainian intellectuals, first and foremost, to try to hold Europe to the principles it professes to stand for? Could we not instead see it as a heartening affirmation of the role Europe has played and could in future play, if one of the most courageous acts of recent history is being grounded rhetorically in the values that the EU is based on? During the Maidan in 2013 and 2014, it was often wryly remarked that Ukrainians were the last ones who actually believed in Europe. And for all that has changed in the intervening 8 years, here we are today, haunted by the image of the outstretched hand of a dead woman in Irpin, an EU flag pendant hanging from her keyring. This war is in a very profound sense a battle to preserve the fundamental things the EU stands for. What are those things that it stands for? In its own description of itself, the values are respect for human dignity and human rights, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law. These are lofty things, but we need to take them seriously. As I look in Ukraine over the past nearly 6 weeks now, I've seen these values playing out in any number of ways. I think of democracy, not just in the sense of elections, of course, but in participation in a common project. The outstanding Ukrainian journalist Natalia Humenyuk has been reporting from cities across Ukraine, and in one of her pieces for the Washington Post, she made the point that today democracy in Ukraine, democracy during times of war, looks like self-organization to care for each other, to support the military, to keep society functioning. Everyone is doing something. Just over the weekend, I read over 400 applications for the non-residential fellowships we here at the IWM are offering, and it was a staggering and humbling experience. Every single one of these people is doing something, designing online courses to teach psychology, literature, history to students who are in bomb shelters and at the front lines, sewing camouflage nets, thinking about how to build a better Ukrainian state and society after the war is over. Like human rights and freedom of expression are also going hand in hand in this conflict in horrible ways. The reporting and information being gathered by Ukrainians helps to build a more complete and accurate picture of the reality of this war. We've been seeing their remarkable reporting in the recent weeks. I should mention that this is something we here at the IWM are also going to be engaged with going forward. I'm pleased to say we're launching a new project documenting Ukraine, which will support journalists, scholars, artists, activists, all sorts of people in Ukraine who are working on projects that document the human experience of the war, and our goal is ultimately to build a complex archive of the materials they produce. And I could point to many other examples, and I'm happy to as we discuss more, of the remarkable ways in which people in Ukraine are living out these values in recent days. Yet for all their belief in the values that the European project is grounded in, this does not mean that Ukrainians are deluded about what the EU actually is today. The experience of the past 8 years, and indeed the past 6 weeks, has tempered expectations. Over the past 8 years, Ukrainians got used to the tacit acceptance of Russian annexation of Crimea and invasion of the Donbass, constant accusations of nationalism, Russophobia, the general European weariness of the topic of Ukraine. This changed, honestly, somewhat in the first days of the war, as Europe presented an unusually united front in condemning Russian aggression and committing to support Ukraine through sanctions and military and humanitarian aid. There was a certain sense, if cautious, that perhaps Europeans had realized what was at stake in this war. Before long, though, Versailles failed to produce meaningful progress towards EU membership prospects for Ukraine. Promised deliveries of military aid were faulty or slow, and the hand-wringing over ensuring that we were not isolating Russia too much intensified. There was still spectacular solidarity shown by civil society across the EU, and here I think first and foremost of what has been happening in Poland. This is something that we should take to heart, the way that civil society has mobilized to accept, to find ways to help the now over 4.2 million people who have been displaced outside of the borders of Ukraine, not to mention those who have been internally displaced. However, with the scenes from Kyiv Oblast over the weekend, I fear we've reached what could become a new turning point in Ukrainians' attitudes towards Europe. I see this especially after the publication of the RIA Novosti piece yesterday, which made explicit Russian intentions towards Ukraine. You may all have seen this. This was an article that said very explicitly that it was not just the fighting forces, not just the elite that had been Nazified, to use this depraved language, but instead the mass of the population. This is a sign of something truly horrific that lies ahead of us, I fear. I think Zelensky's changing tone here is revealing, right? If in the early days of the war, he was pleading for EU membership, for Europe to fully embrace Ukraine, to recognize, he's now calling out Merkel and Sarkozy by name for what happened in 2008 with NATO. I think that this is a flip that will happen if Europe does not recognize that it needs to respond in a stronger way right now. Some sort of sign that Europe recognizes the gravity of what is already underway and has the potential to worsen is essential. We can talk about what that would mean. If gas is a bridge too far for Germany, this is a shame in my view personally, but at least oil and coal may look plausible. Finally, I would just like to say that we're here to talk about Ukraine and the future of Europe, and I would put it quite strongly. If there is to be a future for Europe, there must be a Ukraine as a country that exists on the map of Europe, and Europe's vision of itself must include Ukraine. And I mean this in two senses. If the Russian regime is allowed to annihilate Ukraine, surely we cannot imagine that that will be the end of the conflict. But also, if Europe fails to recognize what Ukraine is fighting on behalf of, it becomes a meaningless project. The good news for the EU is that Ukrainians are not turning on the values that the European project upholds, but what will remain when this war is over.
Kate, thank you very much, and thank you for the clarity of what you were saying about Ukraine and the future of Europe. I will ask some questions later, but let's hear Tim first of all.
Three years ago, I started writing a history of contemporary Europe, and at the end of the chapter on 1945, I asked the question, seeing how badly things were going in Europe, are we fated to go all the way back to the hell that we saw in 1945? Little did I imagine that 3 years later the question would have been answered, and that in Ukraine we would see horrors only comparable with those of Europe in 1945, Mariupol looking like Warsaw, 1944-45, or Coventry or Hamburg, Babin Yar being hit, the site of the massacre, Boris Romanchenko, a survivor of Buchenwald, and 3 other Nazi camps killed by Russian bombardment in Kharkiv and now Bucha. Never again, we said after 1945. It happened again in former Yugoslavia, and after Srebrenica, we said, never again, and we've allowed it to happen. And I think the first thing we have to do is to face up to the immensity of this tragedy, to bow our heads in shame that we allowed it to happen again, and then to ask how and why we came to allow it to happen. But in the meantime, what can we do? Because every peace begins with a war, and the shape of the peace depends on the course of the war. And the big thing that has changed in the last 43 days is the extraordinary courage and skill of Ukrainian military and civil resistance has completely changed the course of the war from anything that almost anybody expected. And so I so much agree with you, Kate. Now it's over to Europe to do more. And President Zelensky tells us with extraordinary skill and clarity on his amazing Twitter feed, after every conversation with a European leader, what he wants us to do. 3 things: weapons, sanctions, and make Ukraine a declared candidate for EU membership. So weapons, we've done a lot, but we need to do even more. Whatever is necessary, more sophisticated anti-aircraft missiles, tanks if we can get them in, planes if we can get them in, everything short of NATO actually going to war with a nuclear-armed Russia, so that when it comes finally to something that might be called a peace negotiation, Ukraine will control as much as possible of its own territory and be in as strong as possible a negotiating position. In order to contribute to do that, we need to do more on sanctions. The key is oil, gas, and coal. Germany alone is still sending, because the prices have gone up through the roof as a result of the war, about 200 million euros a day in paying for Russian energy. 43 days times 200 million, do the maths, that's over 8 billion euros that Germany alone has paid directly into Vladimir Putin's war chest. And have no illusions, the Russian energy industry is part of Putin's own system. Say 8 billion, 8 to 9 billion. Estimates of the Russian military budget last year were in the order of 60 to 70 billion euros. So think about it. Germany's energy payments alone, roughly speaking, cover the entire Russian military budget. This is a morally shocking position for Germany to be in effect, co-financing Putin's war on the very territory, a war of terror on the very territory where Germany itself fought a war of terror 80 years ago. So I can see that there is a very large economic and social cost to doing energy embargo, but there's a very large moral cost to not doing something. And of course, the same applies to a smaller degree to Austria. Practically speaking, I suspect it's right to say start with oil, which is a larger part of the Russian actually revenue, but not such a large part of the actual Western energy economy. Now I come to his third demand, which is declare us as a candidate for EU membership. This poses the question, what is Europe and where is Europe? In President Zelensky's amazing address to the European Parliament, there was one sentence that was particularly remarkable. He said to the leaders of the EU, I quote, "Do prove that you are indeed Europeans," thus brilliantly turning on its head 300 years of what I call intra-European Orientalism, in which it was always West Europeans saying to East Europeans, you must prove that you are Europeans. the French and the Germans and the Italians saying to Poles and Hungarians and Serbs and Ukrainians, you prove that you're Europeans. And now he turned it around and said, do prove that you are indeed Europeans. I can imagine President Macron listening to that speech and saying, quoi? Me prove that I'm a European? Moi? So I thought it was a wonderful moment with a deep truth in it, because I think it is fair to say, although it's a rhetorical formula, that they are defending European values in Ukraine. Now, this brings me to my last point to open up the discussion, which I think in response to that, Europe stands at a strategic crossroads, thinking about the next 10 to 20 years and what we're going to do. And this is going to be a simplification, but to analyze is to simplify. And it is the choice to use shorthand between Yalta and Helsinki, between accepting that in the long term Europe is going to be divided on soi-disant realist grounds, therefore accepting that we have double standards, post-colonial norms in our part of Europe, but colonial norms in that other eastern part of Europe. That is to say, accepting a sphere of influence logic, a colonial sphere of influence logic over countries like Ukraine. I can well imagine, and this is for discussion here, there are many people in the room who I'm sure will contribute. I can, I'm afraid, very well imagine the EU actually, in the end, going down that route and settling for some bad peace in Ukraine, some interim status, and by the way, a corollary of this is also to settle for electoral authoritarian regimes in East Central Europe inside the European Union, such as the one I witnessed this weekend being reaffirmed in office in what was clearly not a fair election. Hungary is already an electoral authoritarian regime. So in this Yalta vision, it's not just a single line. There is, so to speak, Europe A, which is France or Germany or Belgium, which has the full package. There's Europe B, which is East Central Europe, where we accept these compromises. And there's Europe C, which is, to use the German word, Zwischeneuropa. You may have gathered from the way I present this that I don't think this is the right way to go. I believe that we should remain true to the logic and ambition of Helsinki, that we should have a realistic idealism, that we should remain committed to the long-term goal of a united Europe, a Europe whole and free, that we should have single standards, apropos something Kate said, and not double standards. For the whole of Europe. And the key to this is what Zelensky keeps telling us. The key to say this is to say, yes, we actually want Ukraine to be a member of the EU, which means also Moldova, it means Georgia, it means long-term, when political change comes, Belarus. And, of course, it necessarily also means the Western Balkans, because you can't say to countries that have been waiting 10, 15, 20 years, sorry, you've got to go to the end of the queue because we're doing Ukraine. Accepted as candidates, that, as we know from history, sets a strategic target from which a whole series of rigorous steps follow, rigorous steps that will take 10, 15 years. I'm not for a moment arguing that we should compromise on those standards, although I think we might do deeper integration in some particular areas. So the green agenda, for example, or the energy union, you can be a bit flexible, but you've got to qualify. And the other corollary of that is, if you're going to use accession conditionality for Ukraine as the framework for long-term democratic consolidation and consolidation of a sovereign state, then you have to get serious about post-accession conditionality. The great mistake we made in the enlargement of the EU was not the enlargement or accession conditionality, it was the fact that we had no post-accession conditionality, and therefore once Viktor Orban got inside, he could do whatever he liked and get away with it, roughly speaking. So that the corollary of the approach I'm suggesting is that the conditionality mechanism for rule of law should be triggered on Hungary as soon as possible. The recovery funds should be held back on grounds of transparency and corruption. And so we're getting serious both about accession conditionality and post-accession conditionality. That, for me, is the vision, the strategic vision that we need to pursue. Two last comments before going into the discussion. The key to whether we embrace it lies with Europe's central power. It lies in Germany. France, for all its great virtues, is never going to embrace this vision of a Europe whose center necessarily moves much further to the east. But Germany might and should, in its own enlightened self-interest. Germany's Ostpolitik for the last 30 years has just gone up in smoke, lies in ruins before us. It needs a new European Ostpolitik. This is what it should be. Last comment. There's a great role specifically for the IWM in this, for this institution. I vividly remember, Ivan, 40 years ago when IWM was founded, the late much-missed Krzysztof Michalski. We had a divided Europe just after martial law had been imposed in Poland. The idea was you bring together intellectual scholars, journalists, policymakers, from East and West in a divided Europe to explore the deeper unities that were always there and to keep alive the aspiration of a more united Europe, which I can tell you in 1982 looked just about as unrealistic as it may look to you to say that Ukraine should be a member of the EU. That is the spirit we need again, and I think IWM can play an important part in bringing that about. Thank you.
Tim, thank you very much for bringing it back to the IWM and to our 40th anniversary, and to remind ourselves that there are enlightened and far-sighted people who are engaged in every time, however small a number they may be in, but they look to the future even though the adversities seem enormous. Let me just preface a few remarks before we go to the questions. This issue of war in Europe, because that was at least the idea after 1945, and as you mentioned, you know, as a social scientist, I never thought that my country would go to war as the Berlin Wall was falling, and we were unfortunately the harbinger of this nationalist populist wave that came much later. And so the evil of history we experienced in the worst way, the return of evil on the European continent. But I'd like to remind ourselves also the fact that even though the much heralded 70 years of peace in at least Western Europe is only partially true, because remember, France waged a colonial war in Algeria until de Gaulle set it independent in 1962 at Evian. Or Portugal waging wars in Africa until 1975 in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau. So it's not that war was totally absent. We need to keep reminding ourselves. And of course, the invasions of the Soviet Union in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. So war has been around us, somewhat removed. Then it came full scale back in Yugoslavia, and then now with this horrendous invasion. But the spirit of Ukraine, I think, is so important because of the Orange Revolution in 2004. That was already the sign that people wanted what we all want: freedom and dignity and the rule of law. And then repeated at the Maidan in the way that it was, that of course in this language of Putin and Russia was a coup d'etat, which it absolutely was not. And so the drive for the Europeanness and joining Europe has been there and being proven once again. Kate, let me ask you just very quickly. You said you read these very moving proposals. What are you detecting there, apart from the very practical ideas that people are giving on what they want to do? Is that drive fully felt in what you were reading?
Yeah, so what I'm reading in these, I mean, is a sense that life has to be carried on despite the conditions, right? So what I'm reading is people who are continuing to teach, continuing to do whatever it was that they were doing before, a sense that we cannot let this war put an end to us in a moral sense, in a very vibrant sense, right? There are initiatives already being dreamed up of how to build Ukraine after this war is over. And I think that that is what is so important about what you said, Timothy, which has to do with creating the conditions for the best possible peace coming out of this. There are people who are thinking now about what they want Ukraine to look like in the future, and I think it bodes well for all of us, right? It is a state that looks very enticing, very promising. There are huge obstacles to getting there. The devastation that is happening right now is going to take a huge amount of effort to repair. It's going to take a huge influx of money. We need to be prepared for that, I think, and it's our obligation, I think, to help them in that regard. But there is a vision for the future, and it is one that is within Europe, within these values that we're talking about here.
And Tim, to you, obviously this is invasion we're seeing rightly, as the famous Kenyan ambassador said, as a post-colonial or rather colonial recolonization vision. How much is the fear of Europe next door, in the sense of using the metaphor of having West Berlin in front of Moscow, part of what Russia and Putin is up to?
Konstantin von Egert, the Russian journalist, said the most important event in Russian politics in the 20 years after 1991 happened outside Russia. It was the Orange Revolution. And I think that if you look at the evolution, actually Ivan Krastev has written very well about this, if you look at the evolution of Russian domestic policy as much as foreign policy, then you see that the Orange Revolution was an important turning point. So that when people start going on about it was all the enlargement of NATO, there are two much larger factors that trump, that far outdo the NATO enlargement factor. The first is his fear of a democracy next door, a flourishing democracy next door. But then even before that, there is his perverted vision of history in which Ukraine is not even a country, as he has said many times. I've told the story a couple of times, but I met him in 1994. Putin was then, nobody knew who he was. He was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. He was already talking about the Russian territories outside the Russian Federation. He explicitly mentioned Crimea. He talked about the 25 million Russians who are outside Russia and said, wonderful phrase, we have a duty to protect them. So the basic revanchist motivation, the notion that my job is to restore the Russian Empire, I think goes way back. And then you add to that the fear of democracy. And only, I think, in third place is the fear of the West and NATO coming closer and closer.
Great. I'll open the floor up. Please raise your hand and do introduce yourselves. Okay, first there, and here. Do we have a microphone going around? Over there, Kaspar, please.
Hi, so I'm Piotr, I'm a fellow here, and I wanted to ask Timothy Gartinash about the Plan A and Plan B, which...
Could you give us your name, please?
Sorry?
You're a fellow, but what's your name?
Piotr Cislik. So, even though I'm wholeheartedly about, like, for the idea of post-accession conditionalities, my problem is whether it's not kind of recreating the Plan A within the Plan B, because when you have post-accession conditionalities, then you can, in effect, also create Europe A, B, and C within this kind of large camp. So did you think about this problem?
Thanks for a great question. I mean, you're absolutely right. If it only applies to Poland and Hungary and the East European countries. And so one of the reasons it's been slow to come in, and Natalie Tocci knows this extremely well, is that the other member states are afraid that of the sort of absurd idea that it might actually apply to them and not just to the East European states. So indeed, it would need to be applied consistently on issues of minority rights or rule of law, whatever it might be, across all member states. But where I think you're wrong is to imagine that it would end up in a longer-term division between, as it were, Europe A and B, because if we had actually done this consistently in Hungary, even over the last 10 years, we would not be in the position of having a consolidated electoral authoritarian regime, because he wouldn't have been able to dominate the media landscape in the way he did, to gerrymander the constituencies, to use all the EU funds to consolidate his own position, and so on. So actually, I think it's the path precisely to the opposite, to keeping the European Union closer together rather than having it divided between A and B.
There was a question at the back there. Yep.
Hi, I am Leszek Jażdżewski. I was Europe Futures Fellow, and I am editor-in-chief of Liberty, based in Poland. Quote, I said the delivery of needed supplies to Britain is imperative. I say that this can be done. It must be done, and it will be done. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. End of quote. I think you recognize Franklin Delano Roosevelt saying these words in May 1941. 6 months later, US was at war with Germany. And my question to Timothy Garton-Ash, and thank you for a magnificent speech. I totally support what you said about not having two kinds of Europe, including EU, where we should have the rule of law implied also for Poland and Hungary. There are no two classes of Europeans. But the question is, shall we consider ourselves as allies? Britain stood alone for 1 year before Hitler attacked USSR, 1 year and a half before US actually joined the war actively. Are we, the free world, the Western world, Europe, US, are we allies of Ukraine like the free world was ally of Britain in the Second World War? And shall we consider that we are in a kind of war with Russia and accepting these sacrifices that you mentioned? Because at war there are sacrifices, and at war there are unjust consequences also for the population of Russia in this case. So that's a question to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think the starting point to the answer, Leszek, has to be that it's a mistake to think that Putin thinks he's only at war with Ukraine. Putin thinks he is at war with the West in Ukraine. So whatever we think, he thinks he's at war with the West in Ukraine. And it follows that we are, in some sense, at war with him. And therefore, I agree with you that we should do significantly more. Now, one thing, rather magnificent thing, that Britain did in 1940, when it chose to stand alone and continue to face Adolf Hitler. And you know, in post-Brexit Britain, there aren't all that many occasions one can be proud of one's own country, so I have to recall this, was we're going to say we're going to spend not just blood, but treasure. And basically, Churchill bankrupted the British Empire in 5 years, but won the war, defeated Nazism. So while I do not think that we ourselves should go to war with a nuclear-armed Russia, because the cost of a nuclear war would be so terrible for the world, and Russian military doctrine goes to nuclear weapons much sooner than our military doctrine does, I think we should be prepared to make much more significant sacrifices. Careful studies show that even a complete oil and gas embargo for Germany would cost somewhere between 3 and 5% of GDP. One study estimated €1,000 per head. Really, are we not prepared to make that sacrifice to stop a war of terror in the middle of Europe? That I think we should be prepared to do.
Solly.
Hi, Solly Özel from Istanbul. Professor Ash, you did not mention Turkey in your inclusive Europe. if this was just a slip, if it was just a slip, fine. If it was deliberate, then how do you reconcile that omission with your inclusive post-colonial idea of Europe?
I want to thank you so much for that question. That really puts me on the spot. Listen, I have always been in favor of enlargement to include Turkey. I had high hopes of it in the 2000s. And if Turkey itself now returned to the position of really clearly committing to what it involves to become a member of the European Union, I would be strongly in favor of it. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the difference, it seems to me, at the moment is that there is a passionate desire on countries like North Macedonia or Ukraine to become members of the European Union. Now, can I just add, before you say it yourself, that my position was not actually the position taken by the EU. The position taken by the EU is well summarized in the German word Jein, which means yes and no. And that, I think, is a great mistake. Jein to Turkey, yes.
Our own conditions today are well known. And as for our rulers, today they may be in favor of Europe, tomorrow they may be not in favor of Europe. That is also fine. But the countries that you've cited are not any nearer to fulfilling the standards of the European Union than Turkey, mostly, number one. Just put the corruption thing at the forefront. There are illiberal democracies or authoritarian or competitive authoritarian countries within the European Union. I understood what you were saying as the ideal of creating a Europe that was without classes. And so my question was not about whether Turkey today is prepared or ready to join, but whether or not it is included in your understanding of Europe. Because in your case, you include all the countries to the east of Turkey so long as they're Christian. That is going to be the argument that will be made. But not Turkey, which has had an association agreement with the Union since 1963. That we have not been fulfilling our own obligations is correct, but that the European Union did not fulfill its own obligations is also correct. So I don't mean to make it a ping-pong match of who's at fault. But my question is really pretty specifically, not about readiness. Why would you omit Turkey in a projection of a future Europe?
I hereby and herewith included. I mean, my focus was on Eastern Europe, so forgive me. And I think it's very important that Europe makes a statement. Europe, a continent which has so many million Muslims who are Europeans, fellow Europeans, that it's possible for a majority Muslim country to be a member of the European Union, like Bosnia, I hope, one day. So I absolutely agree. Just one further word on that, though. I mean, we have a real issue of hypocrisy, but also of confusion inside the European Union. We are consistently saying things that we don't really mean. To bring it back to Ukraine, I said to Jose Manuel Barroso in 2005, immediately after the Orange Revolution, why don't you declare that you want Ukraine to be a candidate member of the European Union? And he said, 2 major member states would immediately slap me down, France and Germany. And exactly the same thing happened with Turkey, as you know. So that the lack of clarity amongst ourselves, I mean, let's be clear, there are quite a few member states, or certainly citizens of member states, who think we've already enlarged too far. You know, many of us have had conversations in Brussels with people who say, I don't know why we let the Poles in anyway, or the Hungarians in anyway. So the lack of clarity and the lack of honesty seems to me a real problem.
I will now collect questions by 3. So Rosa, then Nicole, and then Natalie.
Thank you very much. Premise that I agree with every single word both of you said, right? So I don't want to be polemical at all, but I just have two questions. In fact, I don't think my questions are polemical. I have a question, Timothy Garton-Ash, on your quotes, Churchill bankrupted the empire but won the war. And I'm thinking how this might resonate today. We've seen there's been, 31 countries have abstained from the UN Security Council resolution, and there are a variety of comments about European hypocrisy, about, we didn't treat the Syrians like we're treating the Ukrainians, it's just because they're Europeans, etc., etc. But more than that, although Europe will pay the costs of this war, more so if Europe actually decides to become more incisive, but the rest of the world will as well. And I'm just wondering about bandwidth. To what extent, in the middle of an energy crisis, after 2 years of COVID, are we willing also to pay the costs in terms of food security in Africa, et cetera, and the fact that these are parts of the world where China and Russia have really stepped up their own geopolitical game. So I'm just wondering, your reference to Churchill actually made me think, this was a very European and Eurocentric effort. Are we thinking about the rest of the world? And then the second question is to both of you about what IWM does. And in the past few weeks, every day that goes by and every new war crime and atrocity committed by the Russian army on Ukrainian soil makes it harder to think about future dialogue, reconciliation between Russians and Ukrainians. And this is, for me, extremely worrying. So I'm just wondering what can be done. I mean, there's also been some debates in the world of culture, sport, academia. Ukrainian academics have asked Russian universities not to be included in several projects. And there was also an FT op-ed arguing, Russian society risks becoming complicit, not just a hostage of Putinism. How do we deal with that? Thinking of Helsinki 2.0, or how do we deal with that?
Nicole.
Yeah, thank you very much. Nicole König from the Jacques Delors Center. I have also two questions really for your idealist realism scenario. The first one is, you said, of course, the big key lies in Germany, and Germany has to change its position on accession, and that France might not share the same vision. I mean, I agree with you on Germany, perhaps it could move. We see also a change in public opinion there, but how do you convince France of this vision, is my first question. And the second question is, I see this sort of longer term vision of your Helsinki scenario, but how do we get there? If you have you need to have some kind of negotiated peace between Russia and Ukraine. So what could actually be the more concrete terms of this peace agreement?
And Natalie.
Okay, so two questions. The first, Tim, on the, I thought that the point that you made was very compelling, sort of enlargement, one side of the coin, internal conditionality as the other. And I think, in a sense, kind of Hungary is the easy argument to make here. I just wonder what you think the position should be now towards Poland. In that in that logic, yeah. The second question is, I think, following on in a sense both from Rosa and from Nicole, the sort of end state, question. I think, again, you made a very compelling point when you said that, every peace follows a war and every peace is determined by how that war went. And I think that's true both in the kind of more obvious sense, meaning who wins the war, but also in terms of what actually happens during that war. Now, if, and I guess this question is to both of you. So, again, the sort of quote-unquote easy part of that end state is, if you think of it, the security part. So it's something that looks like, neutrality and EU membership and security guarantees. Fine. The difficult part, precisely because of how the war is going, Bucha and how many more Buchas we're going to discover, is the territorial piece of it. And, you know, given what is happening, I find it almost inconceivable to imagine territorial concessions beyond what was already the case on the 24th of February. And if that's the case, then you end up in a solution which pretty much amounts to a total defeat of Russia. And what are the implications of that within Russia itself?
You want to have a go, Kate?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you for all of these questions, and I will try to tackle them slightly. Rosa, your question about, this was posed to Timothy, but I actually want to speak a little bit about the rest of the world. And I think this goes back to the point that you were making a little bit about the moral cost of this, that does not only implicate Ukraine right now, but it implicates all of us and the rest of the world. But that has a flip side to it as well, which is to say that ending this war, stopping to support Ukraine in this war, then has, in order to provide, to secure the grain supply, to do whatever we're doing, has a moral cost of its own, right, down the line. It sends this sign that we will, for example, play with autocrats, with rulers who are willing to wage these wars of terror. And I think that that, down the line, may have implications that we haven't yet started to think about for example, these countries of the third world that we're talking about here. In terms of the other question you pose with regards to the sort of possibilities of dialogue between Ukrainians and Russians going forward, this is not something that I am willing to ask Ukrainians to do at this moment. As bombs are falling, as their towns are being destroyed, as they are giving their lives in defense of their country, I am simply not going to ask them to do this. In the long run, this is something that we are going to have to confront, think about, be careful in how we do it. But until this war is over, I'm not ready to go there. In terms of the peace settlement, right? My starting point, and the point that I always want to keep coming back to, is that Ukrainians are the ones fighting this war. It is up to them to decide what they are willing to accept at the end of this war. What territorial concessions, I can't imagine. They should not be asked to make territorial concessions. Crimea and the entirety of the Donbass should go back to Ukraine. I mean, this is clear. This is the Ukrainian position, and it is justified, I would argue. How we make that happen, right? We need to keep supporting them. We need to keep saying, you get to decide for yourselves. You are the ones bearing this cost right now. Bringing them to the table in a way that, for example, Minsk, Normandy, didn't necessarily treat them as equal partners in the decisions of their own fate. That is a mistake I think we need to rectify going forward.
Rosa, food security in Africa and the Middle East, you mentioned Churchill. You will remember that there was an absolutely terrible famine in Bengal during the Second World War, which Churchill accepted as the price of going on fighting Hitler in Europe. So there were these really dreadful, tragic choices. Since most of Russian Ukrainian grain exports go to the Middle East and North Africa, actually, if you stop the war, that's the best way to get them flowing again. On the great powers who are not sympathetic, there was a really rather shocking photograph about a week into the war of Lavrov receiving the BRICS ambassadors. I don't know if you saw it, all of them smiling sweetly, including the ambassador of India, the largest democracy in the world. And so I think there is a real tension here between the democracy agenda with which Biden came into office and the real politics of forming coalitions against Russia and against China, and we just have to face up to that. Nicole, how do I persuade France? I have no chance of persuading France at all. An Englishman is the worst person to persuade France of anything at all, and an Englishman outside the EU. But I'll tell you who can persuade France, and that's Germany. That's why Germany is key to this, and the deal would be, you go with us on our new European Ostpolitik, and we'll go with you on some of your big ambitions, for example, more of a fiscal union in the Eurozone, which your cook is now key financial economic advisor to Olaf Scholz in principle favors, and strategic autonomy, l'Europe puissance. So I think that's how you persuade France. Poland, because I'll come back to the peace settlement, Natalie, it was Natalie, you asked about Poland. Very difficult. I think what's actually going to happen is that they're going to make a crude deal, go soft on Poland, but I hope stay firm on Hungary. What should happen is that you absolutely reward Poland for its very stalwart stance on Ukraine and for taking genuinely more than 2 million refugees who are staying in Poland. Whereas the Hungarian refugees, I talked to them a few days ago, are all moving on to anywhere else. So that significant funds should flow. I think there is a compromise there on the rule of law issue, the technical issues, disciplinary chamber, which is just about acceptable. I mean, it's a pretty lousy compromise, but just about. What we should not go soft on is the erosion of democracy in Poland. So we should keep an absolute eagle eye on the things that really matter for democracy in Poland. For example, media pluralism, including foreign ownership of media. So that's, I think, the best we can do. Now to the peace settlement, which we are so far away from at the moment that I just get irritated how much media time is spent on the latest talks. I fear that Putin is not going to settle for less than a significant chunk of territory. What he could clearly sell to the Russian people would be Crimea, land bridge through Mariupol to Donbass, and the 2 oblasts, which they have claimed, of Donetsk and Luhansk. The Russian people have been told that this is what the war is about. So that he could sell to the Russian people. The question is, can he sell it himself? That is totally unacceptable to any legitimate Ukrainian government. There is no way in which any legitimate Ukrainian government could accept that, and no way, shape, or form any Western government should even hint that Ukraine should accept that, because that would be to make the mistake of Yalta. The mistake of Yalta was not that we didn't keep the Soviets out, because as Dariusz Stolar knows, the Soviets were already there. The mistake was that we gave an ambiguous legitimacy to the Soviet occupation. That was the mistake of Yalta. So we mustn't make the mistake of giving an ambiguous legitimacy to this. What follows from that is, and I'm afraid, I mean, nobody knows what's going to happen, let's be clear, but what seems to me one possible outcome is a very large frozen conflict. That at some point the Russians stop with whatever the territorial line of control is. They say what's ours, what's yours is negotiable. And the question is, what do we do then? We cannot accept it, we cannot recognize it, certainly not de jure. So we're probably going to have to live for some time with a frozen conflict. And people then say, so how on earth can you advocate EU membership for a country which has a frozen conflict? Let me remind you that Cyprus is a member of the EU with a frozen conflict. So we have a member state which has a frozen conflict. And let me further remind you that Germany itself was a frozen conflict for 40 years. Between 1949 and 1990, Germany was a frozen conflict. And mysteriously, that didn't stop us taking West Germany into the European community. So if that frozen conflict is really frozen and stabilized like the dividing line between the 2 Germanys, it seems to me you can go a very long way down the road in real terms to reconstruction and integration. But of course, that cannot be what we want to propose, let alone to prescribe.
The sanctions would stay.
So this is a very, very tricky one, the sanctions question. I think most of them should stay. But, you know, at some point, if I'm President Zelensky and my country is being trashed and ruined and my people killed, and that deal comes onto the table, and the deal is that some of the sanctions are lifted in return for Russian troops withdrawing from the rest of the territory of Ukraine, it's as Kate said, it's up to them. Only he can make that call. But if he made that call, one can understand it.
I will just add to your example that Serbia has been told since 2000 that the EU will never take a new Cyprus inside. Please resolve your Kosovo issue before you enter our home. Final round of questions, because we're already over time, but it's a fascinating discussion. We're first going to Misha Glenny, then here, then Stefan Lehne.
Misha Glenny, I'm the rector-elect of the IWM. I want to ask a question about time and how much time we have, referring back to the food security issue. Already, Egypt, Bangladesh, Indonesia and Sudan have hit the panic button about supplies of wheat to their countries. That's over 500 million people. Brazil has complained to the United States and Europe that sanctions have been imposed on it, which increase the price of fertilizer without any consultation at all. Furthermore, as we've seen with Hungary and Orban's instrumentalization of the war for electoral purposes, we have an election coming up in Brazil of Jair Bolsonaro standing for re-election. Now, if he were to win, with the price of soya going up already 10% in the last month, the temptation for Bolsonaro and the Brazilian farmers to continue with the deforestation of the Amazon will be considerable. So what I want to know is, how much time does Europe have to make its decision about what its strategy is going to be before the implications in the rest of the world are not just worrisome, but catastrophic?
Over there.
Tamás Fóti from the Hungarian press. My question would be, first, how the British establishment affected by the Ukrainian crisis. Is there a reverse Brexit? Secondly...
Is there any
reverse Brexit?
Secondly, yesterday, the Austrian member of the European Commission said that the rule of law mechanism should be triggered in the case of Hungary, but probably not in case of Poland, because judiciary reform, it doesn't affect the European interest, financial interest. What do you think about it? And if I may, a third one, how do you see, on the long run, of course, Russia as a member of the European Union? Thank you.
And Stefan Lehne, right there, please.
Thank you. Stefan Lehne from Carnegie Europe. Tim, when Zelensky says Ukraine should join the European Union, I know exactly where he's coming from, and he has all my support and sympathy. But when you say the same thing, you have also in mind the experience of enlargement in the last 20 years. We've already mentioned the sad experience with Turkey. The Western Balkans got the promise of EU membership in 2003. In the meantime, we've had backsliding in democracy, stabilocracy, unresolved status issues, general loss of momentum of reforms, which is a shared responsibility, I think, of the countries and also of the European Union. So when you, again, want to make enlargement sort of the central piece on the European agenda, you must have in mind a different sort of process. Because we really don't want to do with Ukraine what we achieved with Serbia, for instance. So how would you like to change the process to make it more effective?
Okay, final round. Back to our panel.
Kate, was there any one of those you'd like to pick up, or shall I go?
Sure, Misha, just to speak a little bit to your question here about time, I guess the question I would pose back is, what is the alternative here, right? If Europe is to say, we are going to cease supporting Ukraine so strongly in this, does that necessarily solve these other problems, right? Have processes already been put in place that cannot be fixed by that decision? And is the trade-off worth it here? And I don't know enough about these other situations to be able to say for sure, but I suspect that I might come down on the side of the long-term consequences of ceasing to support Ukraine here are going to be catastrophic in ways that we also don't yet know. So the time horizon here is a very tricky one, absolutely. I think, I'll leave that there.
On Misha, time, I think you've just made a compelling case for giving it everything we've got as soon as possible, including the oil and gas sanctions. Precisely, we're in summer, by the way, that also helps. So, you know, the counter-argument that comes back, you hear this a lot in Germany, including from Habeck and Scholz, is this sustainable for the long term? This is not about the next years, it's about weeks and months. So give it everything we've got while it's summer and we don't need so much energy. Stefan, this is a longer conversation, but I mean, the very short answer is absolutely learn both from the successes of the earlier rounds of enlargement, first 15 years after 1990, and the failures and problems subsequently. So do it better, absolutely. Has the British establishment learned anything? Well, there's a question we might ask. I mean, some of us have pointed out that faced with the Ukraine crisis, it might have been quite useful if Britain had still been in the European Council. Liz Truss sounding off about sanctions doesn't really have any effect at all, rather the reverse. But in terms of actual, it was your question, actual rethinking, no, not substantial rethinking about Brexit. 40 to 45% people still say it was the right thing, hélas. Rule of law mechanism, I think we talked about a moment ago, namely, there simply is effectively more or less a negotiated compromise. Not a very good compromise, but a compromise between Poland and the EU. I want to finish on Russia, because one of the things, if I may say so, Ivan, that I really liked about this discussion is that we spent over an hour actually talking about Ukraine. It drives me crazy that discussions about Ukraine within 5 minutes turn into discussions about Russia or about the United States or about ourselves. We've actually talked about Ukraine. But obviously, longer term, we have to think about Russia. I'm not a Russian expert. There are great Russia experts in the room. But it seems to me clear that we can only be in a defensive holding pattern so long as Putin is in power. And that until it's no longer about changing the mind of the Russian president. It's about waiting until the time when the Russians change their president. Okay? And at that point, we have to think what our longer-term strategy to Russia is. And in my view, if they want a special partnership with the EU, we should very seriously think about it. And I have said all along, if a democratic Russia wanted to join the Euro-Atlantic Security Alliance called NATO, I think in principle it would be a very good thing, a democratic Russia. And behind this realistic idealism is not just some sort of liberal bien-pensant stuff. There's also a hard geopolitics of it. Because if the next 50 years about Europe between a declining US and a rising China, then actually what Alfred Mackinder called the heartland, Eurasia geopolitically, is crucial to our future. So there's also a strong geopolitical argument for this strategy of consistent eastward enlargement, which in the end doesn't stop at the frontiers of a democratic Russia. In the meantime, I think it's really, and this is my last word, and this applies to our project at Oxford too, the Europe in a Changing World, where we have a Russian partner, the High School of Economics in Moscow. I think it's really important that we don't punish the entire Russian people, Russian colleagues, intellectuals, students, who are as horrified by this war as we are.
Thank you, Tim. And in fact, I think we've really broached the theme of this conference rightly with Ukraine in all the ways that we have done. And I don't think there's been a more pressing moment for the European Union, for Europe, to make hard choices in the coming weeks, because, as we said, timing is crucial, and those hard choices have to be made. If they're not made, Europe does not live up to its mission and to its lofty goals that it has been able to implement in a certain area, but now it has to go further. Let's thank both Tim and Kate. Thanks, Kate. That was terrific.